We begin this morning with the reopening of the federal government. President Trump and Congress reached an agreement last night to end the 35-day partial government shutdown for at least 3 weeks. The deal provides a window until mid-February for negotiations on border security. It also means that more than 750,000 federal workers will get paid for the first time in more than a month. Nicole Killion is at the White House with the latest. Nicole, good morning.
Good morning to you, Anthony. And late last night, President Trump signed that bill to reopen the federal government, but it doesn't include money for the border wall. And some Republicans are criticizing the move as a concession to Democrats. But in a tweet, the president denied he caved in.
We have reached a deal to end the shutdown and reopen the federal government.
The longest government shutdown in history came to a close yesterday after President Trump agreed to fund the government for the next 3 weeks while Congress continues negotiations on border security. It came on the day that many of the 800,000 furloughed federal workers missed their second paycheck, and airports around the country experienced flight delays due to sick-outs by air traffic controllers working without pay.
I want to thank all of the incredible federal workers and their amazing families who have shown such extraordinary devotion in the face of this recent hardship.
The administration had been criticized for minimizing the toll the shutdown has had on federal workers. At a Washington food bank, they welcome the news.
It's about time. I hope that it is a little more sustainable than 3 weeks.
This for you means what?
That my family will be able to pay our bills and we'll be able to keep our homes and, be off the street and stop begging for food.
Last night, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi signed the continuing resolution after the House and Senate voted unanimously to reopen the government.
Democrats are committed to border security, and we think we have some better ideas about how to do so that protect our border, honor our values, and are cost-effective.
Negotiations will continue until mid-February, but unless a deal is reached between lawmakers over funding for a border wall, the threat of another government shutdown remains.
If we don't get a fair deal from Congress, the government will either shut down on February 15th again, or I will use the powers afforded to me under the laws and the Constitution of the United States to address this emergency.
Democratic leaders have been emphatic that they won't give the president a penny to build the wall. In the meantime, the president's State of the Union speech is up in the air. It was supposed to happen this coming Tuesday, but now Speaker Pelosi says that she will work with the president on a mutually agreeable date. Michelle?
Mark your calendars. Thank you, Nicole. 35 days. 35 days of federal workers rationing asthma medicine for their kids, sleeping in cars, driving Uber, late night shifts just to make ends meet. And this man is not getting a single penny for his wall. 35 days. And that people are applauding him. This man single-handedly shut down the government. It is shameful. Dana Basham, starting with you. I heard no explanation as to why he did this and why he accepted this deal. 35 days later, he still is not getting what he wants.
There's a 4-letter word to describe what we just saw, and that's cave. There's no other way to describe it. The president caved after, as you said, more than 30 days, after all of the real world ramifications of what has gone on. He hasn't gotten a dime for his wall. But it's because things have gotten so bad. Obviously, we know that not just from common sense, but from reporting, that he realized he didn't have a choice but to do exactly what Democrats have been asking him to do since day one. You want to have a negotiation, Mr. President? Great, we'll have a negotiation. But let's reopen the government first and then have the negotiation. That is what's happening now. It was exactly what was asked of him by Democrats and some Republicans, to be fair, back when the shutdown began. The one thing I will say that he did say at the very beginning, before he went on with his messaging opportunity, taking advantage of the fact that all of the networks were taking this event live, he did hold out the potential for doing something else. And I have been told by a couple of Republican sources that that is the executive action, perhaps the national emergency, something else that he could do with his own power. Obviously, we talked about it could be and would be challenged in the courts. But my guess is, as he's going to see the coverage, there's no other way to describe it other than a cave, he might be itching to do something that shows that he at least is doing something within his power.
Years from now, when people ask what the longest government shutdown in U.S. history was all about, what will be said? The short answer, of course, is the wall. The 35-day shutdown over the wall, which caused immeasurable suffering to hundreds of thousands of Americans, ended today. The same day that Roger Stone, the longtime Donald Trump advisor who invented the idea of building the wall as a trick to remind Donald Trump to talk tough on immigration at his campaign rallies, was taken into custody in the early morning hours by more than 24 federal employees working without pay, armed FBI agents, and indicted by Robert Mueller. Donald Trump's terrible Friday started with that news and ended with him violating one of Roger Stone's cardinal rules of politics: never admit defeat.
I am very proud to announce today that we have reached a deal to end the shutdown and reopen the federal government. As everyone knows, I have a very powerful alternative, but I didn't want to use it at this time.
You know, Donald Trump put a brave face on that, but that is what total abject defeat sounds like. That is what complete surrender to Nancy Pelosi sounds like.
We're grateful to Democrats on both sides of the Capitol for their unity that was very, very important in these discussions. It's sad, though, that it's taken this long to come to an obvious conclusion. I quote Lincoln all the time: public sentiment is everything, that you can accomplish almost anything. And we thank the public for weighing in so strongly.
35 days of a shutdown, and Donald Trump got nothing. 800,000 federal workers got the financial hardship of 2 missed paychecks. Another 1.2 million federal contractors will never be made whole. Members of the Coast Guard were forced to go to food banks. Law enforcement agencies were begging for money to enable them to just do their jobs. Today, airlines began grounding flights as air traffic controllers called in sick, and all for nothing. Tonight, the president signed the legislation he vowed not to sign after it passed in the Senate and the House. It will fund the government for 21 days. But just because Donald Trump got nothing doesn't mean the situation is the same as it was 35 days ago. Nancy Pelosi took on Trump and beat him. The Democratic caucus stayed united. And it's starting to sound like the Republican caucus is changing course.
This is good news. This is long-awaited news. In fairness, Mr. President, this never should have happened.
And of course, Trump's base feels betrayed. Conservative commentator Ann Coulter, who prior to the shutdown was enjoying the power to order the President of the United States around, tweeted, quote, "Good news for George Herbert Walker Bush. As of today, he is no longer the biggest wimp ever to serve as President of the United States." One headline for right-wing media outlet Breitbart News read, "Government open and border no wall, still no SOTU." Tonight, Donald Trump took to Twitter to try and claim defeat is not defeat, with a vague threat about what could happen when the temporary funding runs out in 21 days. Well, this was in no way a concession. If no deal is done, it's off to the races, exclamation point. Joining us now is Tim O'Brien, executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion and an MSNBC contributor. Neera Tanden, president of the Center for American Progress, and Eugene Robinson, associate editor and Pulitzer Prize-winning opinion writer for The Washington Post. And he's also an MSNBC political analyst. And Eugene, I'm actually going to start with you on this, just to give us kind of your big picture of what we saw today. You saw a president probably at his weakest moment. Yeah. If you split screened Donald Trump and Roger Stone, it would be hard to tell which of them was getting indicted, because Roger Stone looked jubilant, throwing up his hands like Nixon, and Donald Trump looked completely deflated.
He was deflated. He couldn't even convince himself of what he was saying. He said, well, we have a deal. Well, it's not a deal. It was a capitulation. It was the deal the exact deal with no alteration, no variation whatsoever that he could have had 35 days ago. It was basically the deal that he had agreed to and then reneged on back in December. It was not a deal. It was a surrender. And you know, one thing that has struck me, there's a fabulous story in the Washington Post posted tonight by my colleague Phil Rucker and others about sort of the inside TikTok of this capitulation. And one thing that comes through is what terrible advice Donald Trump was getting. Not that you can tell him anything, but people like Jared Kushner completely misread the political situation, completely misread the Democratic caucus. They all misread Nancy Pelosi. It's not like she's an unknown quantity. She's been around for a long time. Everybody in Washington knows who she is and how she operates and could know what to expect. But they had no clue. They've been here 2 years and they had no clue of how to do this negotiation, and they paid the price.
You know, Tim O'Brien, as somebody who's been a biographer of Donald Trump, they could have just watched television, which is what Donald Trump does all day, to know what the temperature was. It's shocking that they wouldn't know that Democrats were not going to give Donald Trump a wall. It's not happening. But it was interesting to see that split screen where Roger Stone seemed like kind of having the time of his life, even though he was just indicted. And Donald Trump looked completely, the air was sucked out of him. What do you think is going through his mind right now?
I don't think Donald Trump never stays down for very long. So I don't think Donald Trump operating in the public eye in a defeated or deflated mode is something that's going to continue very long. And I think the question we have to ask then is, what's the net result going to be when he reinflates? And I think what it's going to be, I suspect, is he will try to invoke national emergency powers on the southern border to try to do a wall that way. I think he's going to get a lot of pressure from Republicans not to do that. I don't know that he'll listen to them. He's going to have to go through a weekend now in which he's being spoken of as being emasculated, being beaten by a woman. He's got Ann Coulter calling him a wimp.
Yeah.
All of this gets to his sense of his own manhood and his masculinity, and he never does well in that situation. So I think he's going to lash out. Yeah,
I mean, a former administration official about reopening the government called it a total cave unless he calls national security emergency when he doesn't get the wall funded in the next 3 weeks. And this was Donald Trump saying sort of the same thing in the Rose Garden today. Take a listen.
So let me be very clear. We really have no choice but to build a powerful wall or steel barrier. If we don't get a fair deal from Congress, the government will either shut down on February 15th again, or I will use the powers afforded to me under the laws and the Constitution of the United States to address this emergency.
Neera Tanden, I don't think I haven't spoken to anybody today who believes that the government will shut down again, that Mitch McConnell will go along with this again. He loves to have this saying about there's no education in the second kick of a mule. Apparently he said that to his caucus. I don't think anybody believes Donald Trump is going to be able to shut the government down again. What about this idea of him trying to save face by escalating the promises now to his base, that now he's going to invoke a national emergency? Your thoughts?
I mean, he may well do that, and I think that would really just kick it to the courts. And, you know, numerous legal experts say it would be unconstitutional. There's clear Supreme Court precedent for that. Obviously, the national emergency was also an issue that was ridiculed by his base. So it does create some wedge issues. But I really think, just to step back for 1 second about where we are, I think one of the reasons why Donald Trump so misjudged Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats and essentially the political situation is because he's been dealing with a Republican Congress for 2 years that just did his bidding. And this today, in my view, was really the first moment where the work that everyone did to elect the House Democratic majority really stopped Trump in his tracks.
Yeah.
And it was a full frontal defeat because he just misjudged, but also she has a strong caucus, not a bare majority caucus, a strong majority and her strength in her caucus strengthens Schumer's hand in his caucus. And so I think he just met the wall, and it was Nancy Pelosi's spine.
Yeah, I mean, the Washington Post has a piece that talks about the prisoner of his own impulse inside Trump's cave, and what they say is that Trump and Pelosi had not spoken since their January 9 session in which the president stormed out of the White House Situation Room. In a private meeting with some columnists earlier this week, Pelosi was asked why she thought Trump had not created a more potent nickname for her than Nancy. She replied, according to a senior Democratic aide, some people think that's because he understands the power of the speaker. And, Tim, is he teachable in the sense that he really didn't clearly know what the Speaker of the House does and didn't understand the power relative to the power of his office? Is there any sign that maybe if he doesn't understand it, that his team now understands it, and that some way they will govern themselves accordingly?
Well, his team's come to it belatedly. Donald Trump has probably the most inept administration ever to occupy the White House. So this isn't just a Donald Trump problem. Jared Kushner has really yet to earn his junior G-Man badge, and they're sending him to be the envoy to the Middle East. They've got him working on immigration policy. They've got him negotiating on the wall, and he's in over his head. There's no one around this president who is competent enough to address the myriad numbers of policies that come in front of them, to stand up to the president and tell him to listen when he should, because Trump ultimately never listens to anybody. And what you have now in this event is, as Neera said, it's the first sort of landmark failure for this team in which they're exposed, their incompetence is exposed. It's also Donald Trump revealed as an inept deal maker, a guy who came to Washington with a base believing that he was a very competent businessman who could get things done in Washington, even though his track record as a businessman was just as abysmal as this deal he just got plowed under by Nancy Pelosi on. Yeah. And that's all come home to roost.
And for his party, too, it strikes me, Eugene, because, all really that's come out of this is that Donald Trump, his cabinet, and even his daughter-in-law have been revealed to be incredibly callous individual people. The Republican Party look completely weak. They wouldn't vote for the same thing they'd voted for before until a weakened president gave them permission. And Lindsey Graham, who styled himself the new bestie of Donald Trump and Trump whisperer, he's gotten nothing for all of his obsequiousness. And he put himself out on a limb on January 2nd, saying this about these wall negotiations. Let's listen to Lindsey Graham.
If he gives in now, that's the end of 2019 in terms of him being an effective president. That's probably the end of his presidency.
Eugene.
Let's hope.
Well,
let's hope.
I mean, from Lindsey's lips to God's ear, maybe maybe it is the end of his presidency. Who knows? But it's a very interesting question. So you gave the Mitch McConnell line that every Southern senator uses, frankly, about there being no education, the second kick of a mule. So here's my question: how many Republican senators felt the mule kick of this shutdown and will want to avoid repeating the experience? And I don't know the answer to that yet. We do know that there was an extremely tense Republican senators' lunch, I believe it was yesterday, in which their voices were raised. Senator Ron Johnson and Mitch McConnell sort of snarling at each other over the debacle of the shutdown. You had a number of Republican senators, I think six or seven, who voted for the Democratic bill to open the government without wall funding. You had, according to the Post story posted tonight, you had Mitch McConnell calling the president saying, "Look, my senators are in revolt. I can't hold this. You're gonna have to give up." So has that changed? Is there another change in Washington? Not just Nancy Pelosi as another power center, but is there a change in the Republican Senate? And I'm not sure of the answer, but we'll see.
And Neera, he didn't even get the State of the Union. There's some theories out there that maybe he decided, he would give in so that he could have his TV show. Nancy Pelosi said, we're not doing that either until the government's fully open. He didn't even get the TV show back.
Yeah, I mean, I think he'll get it eventually, but it's going to be on her terms and not his. And just to follow up on what was just said, I think a really important thing that we have to recognize here is the psychological damage to Trump's base. I think, as Tim said, The wall was a central promise for Trump to his base, the idea that he is a strong negotiator. He set this whole thing up to go mano a mano against Democrats, and he failed. And I think the one question is how this will move into the future. Republicans really were hurt by following him, and these poll numbers have been terrible. You have a number of Republicans who were up in 2020, Joni Ernst, Tillis, others who voted one way, voted against themselves, and then voted the other way. I mean, these people just voted against yesterday, voted against a bill that they voted for today.
Yeah.
So I think, I think a lot of people are going to wonder whether following Trump, like they have in lockstep, makes sense when it's been such a political disaster over the last several weeks.
Well, Tim, I'll ask you that then, because Donald Trump is not accustomed, number one, to no, and also to having to admit failure. Today he did have to admit failure. I wonder if does he wind up getting abandoned here? Because he has delivered nothing but failure at the hands of a woman, no less.
At the hands of a woman. He actually didn't admit failure. He had the bizarre statement of saying, we don't build medieval walls, we build smart walls. And there is no money in this interim bill for a wall at all.
Right.
So he wasn't really admitting defeat. He was telling a narrative that he could stomach in the Rose Garden. What he's going to go now is he's going to go home and count his marbles and figure out how he's going to have to come back at this group. But what he's done along the way is he's frayed his base. He's frayed the GOP. He has done reputational damage to the country. He has caused logistical, financial, and reputational damage across the board that's going to be very hard for him to come back from.
Yeah, indeed. It's been quite a 35-day spectacle. Neera Tanden, Eugene Robinson, Tim O'Brien, thank you all very much.